promises are being made, ideas are being thrown around about how we can crowd more climate finance into Africa. And we need to know whether any of that stuff is making a difference. And unless you've got a decent baseline, you're not going to be able to do that. All those promises will be just empty air. And so that's what we felt was really important. Let's have that baseline, and then we can see how successful we're all being. What we can safely say, and my colleague from CPI, Darshan, is going to be giving you the actual hard numbers. There is, of course, a very, very large gap between how much finance there is in Africa right now and what the stated need is from African governments. And he will give you the dimensions of that, but it's a very, very, very large gap. So there is also then an urgent need for innovation to crowd in particularly private finance into this market. But there are also some signs that things may be on the move, particularly around adaptation, and we can talk a little bit about that. There's plenty of things that we need to think about as this research as we present this research. But one of the things that maybe I'd like you to have a think about is that we tend to think of climate finance as something extra, an extra cost. In reality, it doesn't need to be like that. It can be, if we get better at mainstreaming climate finance into government spending plans, that's not an extra cost. It's cost you would have incurred anyway. And I think there is a sort of mindset around climate finance which says when times are tough, we can't afford it. And we can only do this stuff when times get better. And the reality is, we all know, times are never perfect to do all that stuff. So we just need to get on with it. And I do think there's a lot that we can do. And I'm thinking particularly about these NDCs. We need to make those NDCs much more granular, much more tangible, so that we can actually get projects out of those NDCs that we will really be able to put funding behind. Welcome, everybody. With that, I am going to ask if Mahmoud would like to take the floor. Dr. Mahmoud, would you like to take the floor, or would you like to come, or do you want to? would you like to draw a breath first? I think you should come up and welcome people yourself. Thank you very much, Dr. Mahmoud. Thank you for coming, everybody. I think you might need to go that way, actually. Yeah.
Right. Good evening to you all. Those who survived happily that long day of discussions from the very early morning. Started, like many of you, like 5 a.m. in the morning, catching up with some stuff that we have to prepare, not just for this important event, but for the COP itself. So I'm very happy to be here. And the focus of the discussion on emerging markets, on Africa, on finance and investment is very relevant to the priorities of COP27. And as I've been saying during the last couple of days, that finance is going to be featured prominently in COP27, not just by having a finance day, but in every and each of the session, there is a finance component. During the 2 days of the leaders, there are going to be some specific discussions. Some sessions will be by invitation only. Some sessions will be with open platforms. But finance, for many reasons, is the issue that we should be all trying to support through the institutions that have been working heavily in the field, through the innovation, and through updates on how can you solve the problems at hand. So when I was in Rotterdam a couple of days ago, discussing adaptation finance, for instance. And the issue that was raised in Paris 24 hours after Rotterdam, the same. Again, the issues related to finance and how that was a meeting that was organized by the Egyptian embassy in Paris. Again, the issue of finance came up strongly. Then another session with Convergences, which is a group, a network of universities, think tanks, research centers based in France and beyond, when they are seeking solutions for the net zeros, not just one, three of them: zero poverty, zero carbon, and zero exclusion. Again, finance came strong in the discussion. And then you all, or many of you, attended the opening session yesterday, and again, finance came strong in there. I'll not take much of your time, but we have the mysterious, what I call the mysterious 3% that we need really to solve. The 100 billion, the famous 100 billion that discussions might be touching upon today, if we manage to have those who committed the 100 billion to fulfill their obligations, that will not be enough. There's going to be only 3% of what is required to fill the gaps of finance. Imagine this is 3% of the gap. It's very serious. Then if you get matters closer to the 3%, it's the share of the private sector participation in adaptation finance for Africa, which is around $11.4 billion. The contribution of the private sector is no more than 3%. Can we do better in this area? What is required? Is it more of matters related to policy frameworks, regulatory frameworks, incentives, de-risking? But we need to have the solutions. Perhaps we can get guidance from the 3% of actual contribution by the private sector and try to extend it to other examples. And of course, the other 3% is the one that was mentioned strongly yesterday, including by the President of the Republic, President Sisi, when he mentioned the limited responsibility of Africa in the emissions that doesn't exceed 3%. But again, the continent bear tough and severe consequences. So what could be the solutions to that? And I look forward to the report, the discussions, and the outcomes of the report. And I congratulate the team behind it as well. First, we need to tackle the 100 billion, not because we're going to solve all of our problems, but we're not going to be receiving any figures in the future unless the 100 billion is going to be fulfilled. The second, which is a big puzzle that we are hoping to have a solution for by a group commissioned by the presidencies of COP26 and COP27, that they should share the outcomes of their report before the end of October. And their report is going to be available, and we'll see what are the best mechanisms to have it as part of the COP27 outcomes. The third is basically about the promise of the private sector that came from the Glasgow Alliance or the GFANs, and how can we make the chapter, which was just 1 day old since launching it yesterday by Mark Carney, how can we make this chapter with the catalytic role that is required to make sure that the real sector is aware of the opportunities available for finance. The GFANS Africa is going to benefit from the support of the Financial Regulatory Authority of Egypt, led by Dr. Mohammed Farid. I'm happy that the new chairman of the Egyptian Stock Exchange with us today, and you might take the floor later. This is my understanding. So very much looking forward to your intervention. We need as well to build on the work that GFANs, the champions, COP presidency, and the UN system have been doing in building up the pipeline of potential investable projects for Africa and beyond. There is some work that have been done in Asia, Latin America, and in a few days will be in Beirut and then in Geneva to complete the list of the projects. Then on innovation, I'll pick two, one related to the carbon markets and one related to debt reduction mechanisms. So those of you who have the knowledge, the expertise, and the willingness to get their act together and mobilize resources, Africa is eager to have its own carbon market. Just a few days ago, Mr. Rami, Dr. Farid, myself were on a call with the experts associated with the London Stock Exchange. And a few weeks before, we had discussions with Singapore Exchange as well. And during the last couple of days, apologies, Rami, and through you to Dr. Farid, I committed you to many. If you need any solutions to carbon markets, please contact our stock exchange and its regulator. That included actually a chat that I earlier had with EBRD and the European Investment Bank and the standard setters represented here in this domain. And I know that you both are going to meet the expectations on establishing a carbon market for the country. Then some of the sessions that we had today touch upon another innovative approach to deal with the accumulated debts in the continent. And I'm happy that serious discussions about debt swaps, a new generation of debt swaps mechanisms have been discussed, linking that to KPIs, linking that to some serious work on standardization, and to add to the innovation, linking the whole thing as well to carbon credit markets when we have one. So we can really see that the whole world is going to be through your innovation. And it's great that we have capable leaders, not just in Asia, but around Africa, that can really handle that work, but that will not be resolved without great partnership that we would be required, including from the initiative and the great work that is conducted by the partners that we have today with us, FSD, for the support from UK aid have been very much beneficial to many African countries, to partnerships and the work of the climate policy initiative. Beyond innovation, there are a couple of things, and I'll end with them. ESG as an investment class is under threat from many perspectives. First, because of issues related to greenwashing. Second, this is a market issue that needs to be resolved through market discipline and market regulation. And then we have the ESG concern because of the cost of investments in ESG that was raised yesterday and today, to the extent that it's being called as well, not just greenwashing, but green exclusion, because some of the markets are becoming difficult to penetrate or access by some of the developing economies and emerging markets. Actually, our Minister of Finance had raised that several times about the value of going green, while green is more costly than the conventional for many reasons. So that needs to be resolved. But more dangerously, some of the calls to abolish ESG altogether and just to replace it by emissions and decarbonization measures. You may have seen that in some of the very popular newspapers and professional magazines. But here the industry needs to defend itself by clearing up, by following standards, and by good regulations and supervisory elements that should be supported. The very final thing, your work here in the innovation, your work in partnerships, the support of development finance institutions, the work of the standard setters, that will not really be helpful without the state itself, any state, not just in our country here, get matters related to sustainability and SDGs more seriously than it is. and document, support, and standardize the work through public finance, because you will find in all cases that the budget of the state, especially in areas related to adaptation, starting work and mitigation, dealing with the implications of all of that, is basically on the shoulders of ministers of finance and being borne by the budgets of the state. So one innovative idea is to go back to basics and make sure that the budgets of the state is fully aligned with what we're talking about. Otherwise, it will be a source of distraction and crowding out and distortion of what we are trying all to do. Having said that, a very big and substantive agenda. I just gave you some teasers, some headlines of that all. In the past, you may have seen only a focus on 100 billion for right reasons, but now we're talking 100 billion plus. We have at least 7 major topics covering areas of finance. Without your good analysis, your good guidance as well to not just to the professionals, but to the general public, because what we're talking about is as important to the general public as it is for the professionals in the field. For that, we thank you, and we thank you all for being here, and looking forward to welcoming you all in Sharm el-Sheikh, inshallah. Thank you all.
Dr. Mahmoud, thank you so much for setting the scene. Before going any further, we are a UK government-funded organization, and we have the very, very sad news that our Queen has died. So what a life she led. What an amazing moment. I think you'll remember this presentation for all sorts of different reasons, but we obviously pass on our sincere condolences to her family, and just wanted to mark that moment. I'm sorry? Let's just do this. We must move on. We have important work to do as well. So with that, I would like to invite Darshan Wignaraja to join, our colleague from Climate Policy Initiative. He's going to take us through the data. He will talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll move into the panel discussion after that. Thank you for your patience again, for staying so late and so long and so overdue. But Darshan, welcome, and thank you very much indeed.
I have quite a selection of equipment, so apologies if I juggle it the wrong way, but I think this is all set up. So let me start by thanking let me just take a moment, because I also am a British citizen, and it's a country which has given me a lot over the years. I too am struck by the news, and I'm very appreciative of the moment of silence that you all shared. So thank you. Right, let me start by thanking the high-level champion, Dean. Thank you very much for setting the context for us. Thank you, Mark, for the work that we've done together. Good evening, everyone. It is a real honor to be talking with you tonight to highlight the critical importance of climate finance in and for Africa. My name is Darshan Wignaraja, and I'm a director at Climate Policy Initiative. CPI has undertaken, with the support of FSD Africa, a first of its kind analysis of climate finance flows in Africa, a preview of which I'm delighted to share with you tonight. This improved understanding of flows helps in three ways. It identifies the gaps as well as opportunities. It informs better policy making, and it pushes both investors and climate negotiators to scale up climate finance. I think many of you would have seen this chart. For over 10 years, CPI has tracked sustainable investment trends. Our latest global report shows annual climate finance flows reached just over 630 billion across an average of 2019 and 2020. As this chart vividly shows, and as you are all very aware, this is nowhere near the needs, which are conservatively estimated at between 4.5 and $5 trillion annually through to 2030. During this decisive decade, our analysis estimates that Africa needs 2.8 trillion or $280 billion annually to implement their own NDCs and meet 2030 climate goals. I'm very pleased to have seen the amount of pickup of these figures, which we shared as a result of the needs analysis. And it's very helpful to see how much resonance they've played or received across the course of the last 48 hours. And as such, the gap is required to grow by 9 times at a minimum. In truth, this gap is likely even greater. Countries often underestimate their needs, especially on adaptation, due to the data and methodological challenges. This is, of course, a huge lift, yet the response to the pandemic highlights what can be achieved. All African subregions receive significantly less climate finance than required. Investment gaps vary between regions and countries. The Southern African region bears the largest gap, but this mainly reflects South Africa, which alone is 107 billion annually. And this highlights the extent to which South Africa has been clear about the needs it sees from its own perspective. And it's combined with one of the lowest levels of climate investment. Within the Central and East African regions, if you compare investment gaps as a share of GDP, several countries such as DRC, South Sudan, Somalia, Seychelles, and Mauritania have gaps ranging between 50% to 130% of their GDP. This highlights just how much finance is needed to be mobilized from external sources, where the disparity is so great. Climate finance is concentrated in specific and potentially too few countries on the continent. 10 countries absorbed more than half of all climate finance. These countries represent 65% of the needs, out of which South Africa alone accounts for 38%, while the bottom 20 countries, where vulnerabilities are the most pronounced, attracted only 11% of the finance. This distribution demands more assessment at an individual country level. This is a classic CPI chart known as a Sankey diagram, showing a snapshot of annual finance flows. In the center, blue bands or flows represent public finance, whilst the orange bands represent private finance, revealing, if you like, the finance mix in quite a granular fashion. On the left-hand side, you will see the source of financial flows. 85% is from international public finance. The pandemic did not prevent it increasing by 2 billion to 24.3 billion in 2020. An interesting insight from this recent research. On the right-hand side, you will notice if you put these two debt buckets together, loans stand at 56% and were the preferred instrument category, followed by grants at 30%, although this clearly varies by country, by sector, and type of project. Now, comparing the public versus private split across global regions, private finance, again highlighted in orange, contributed only 14% in Africa. You can see it here in the dotted column. This is significantly lower than in other regions. Take South Asia, 36%. East Asia and the Pacific, 38%. Latin America, 48%, let alone some of the advanced economies on the right-hand side of the graph. This highlights the opportunities that Dr. Mahaldeen referred to. For the private sector, how can they step up? For policymakers, how can the right regulatory environment and policy decision-making be rapidly advanced and enhanced? For public sources, a recent WRI report shows that for every dollar that MDBs invested, only 29 cents in co-financing came from private sources. So how can scarce public resources be used to maximum effect? Instrument deployment is key. I think this is possibly one of my favorite breakdowns as we consider fiscal space and capital market depth in individual countries. So we can run this analysis at a country level. Here, at a regional level, you see multilateral DFI financing was more than 75% through loans, 77 to be precise, the purple shades in the charts. The lighter purple represents the crucial low cost, below market debt, while grants, the blue shading, stood at roughly 20%. Financing by international governments was mostly in the form of grants. And the last thing I'll highlight on this slide, in the interest of time, is the orange sub-bars, which are equity. And you can clearly see at a glance the scarcity of equity on the continent in climate finance. Obvious and pertinent question is, how do you address that rapidly? Overall, and in comparison, Africa strikes a better balance between adaptation and mitigation. And this is pretty crucial. Globally, financiers only devote typically 7 to 16% of their total climate finance to adaptation. In Africa, this share rises to 39%, 11.5 billion, as we heard earlier. This is a positive trend given Africa's disproportionately high vulnerability to climate change. Yet, the volumes remain low, both comparatively and against estimated needs. So the scale of funding for both adaptation and mitigation must increase dramatically. Now, if you'll allow me, I'll switch to a few sector perspectives. First, energy. According to the IEA, Africa will need around $133 billion annually for its clean energy goals between 2026 and 2030. However, annual investment in renewable energy, seen here in the bottom left set of right boxes, is currently at a mere $9.4 billion. Now, this is arguably the most attractive sector on the region for commercial investors. Whilst not all, as the blocks show, this is significantly less than fossil fuel investments and fossil fuel subsidies on the continent. Whilst not all spending can be green, governments can structure taxes and incentives that favor mainstream low carbon alternatives, ensuring long-term benefits such as job creation and energy independence. A key starting point is to tag and track any green and non-green interventions in national accounts. Whilst on energy, it is clearly a delicate balance, especially in the context of emerging African economies, policy and investment should be increasingly climate aligned. Moving on to agriculture, forestry, and other land use, AFOLU. This diagram highlights flows into individual sectors down the right-hand side: water, AFOLU, transport, energy. In green, and I've just called out AFOLU here, only 16% of total climate finance in Africa, though the cross-sectoral subcategory, which is this one here, may cover some indirect flows, but let's assume that the core flow is 16%. This is striking, as agriculture contributes to over a third of Africa's GDP, employing around 60% of its workforce and accounting for something in the region of 57% of its emissions. So this allows us a deep insight into, are we getting that right? Do we need the private sector to step in more in specific sectors? Finally, cross-sectoral or nexus solutions, critical for economy-wide development, accounted for 29% of climate finance, 8.5 billion. These critically link climate goals with the SDGs. But in addition, these cross-sectoral solutions can provide other co-benefits, such as improving coordination between ministries, particularly executing ministries and finance ministries, and across sectors. Together, 56% of cross-sectoral flows targeted adaptation, 25% into mitigation, and the rest both. So those were the highlights of our findings. Our analysis led us to a set of key recommendations from which we propose 6 priorities. These resonate or reflect some of what we've heard in the last 48 hours. I will close by going through each of these in a little detail. Adapt strategies to address current and future country realities. Debt instruments account for more than half of climate finance in the continent. This exacerbates high debt pressures, compounded by the pandemic and inflationary impacts. This demands solutions that are tailored to local, country-specific factors, such as the individual depth of capital markets, the individual fiscal situation, and the ability to implement. Second, boldness to fund hard-to-abate sectors and less mature markets. Concessional finance players should proactively take on more risk. And crucially, once de-risked and projects are operational, should move swiftly to exit. Stakeholders should commit concessional finance to energy transition opportunities, which deliver just outcomes, hard-to-abate sectors like industry and infrastructure, and sectors where the transition has hardly begun, like natural capital and carbon sinks, biodiversity, and ecosystem preservation, and nascent areas like the blue economy and green fintech. Third, catalyze private finance, including domestic capital. Actual risk, perceived risk, and ticket sizes dissuade private capital players, but several steps could expand investment. Development partners should target, first, the holy grail of pipeline of investable opportunities, then higher leverage ratios through blended finance structures, with a particular focus on an enhanced role for private insurance and partial guarantees, which connect domestic and international finance through participation of networks such as GFANs to country platform approaches such as Egypt's Nahwefi or South Africa's JETP. Fourth, data tracking and disclosure to inform NDC financing strategies. In tracking climate finance, we face pervasive data gaps across actors and sectors. For instance, a lack of clarity on tagging of domestic government expenditure, imperfect coverage of investments from the private sector, and limited visibility of South-South flows. Governments and its agencies can lead this through tagging and tracking. Climate information is also critical to investors. Therefore, private companies also need to produce this information and be pressed to do so. Fifth, enhancing the enabling environment through capacity building. Stakeholders should support African governments to make smarter climate decisions and develop climate relevant policies. Some African countries have relatively robust regulatory frameworks in place, but many do not. We have worked with governments in Kenya, South Africa, and Cote d'Ivoire in support of these aims. Governments can learn from their peers, jointly develop best practices, and inform regulations. The Africa Green Finance Coalition is a compelling example of strong collaboration. Finally, facilitating climate investment at a subnational level. Africa is urbanizing at pace, and cities will have a crucial part to play in the low carbon transition and in adaptation. Yet some regulations limit provinces, counties, and cities from empowering local governments. Expanding their financial or operational capabilities would improve vertical integration by avoiding policy gaps between national action plans and local initiatives. So, stepping back, this is just a preview. In conclusion, improving the quality and depth of analysis is a key component of realizing our collective ambitions. It allows us to be more granular on investment opportunities, pipeline opportunities, and more practical in the pursuit of the appropriate sources of finance. I hope this sets some of the context for the panel discussion we're about to go into and the work ahead in the final straight before COP27. The full landscape of climate finance in Africa will be published on September the 19th, and we will disseminate it at that moment. My thanks again to the High-Level Champion and FSD Africa and the International Collaboration Forum for this opportunity. Mark, back to you.
Fantastic. Darshan, that was wonderful. Thank you so much indeed. That was a really good snapshot. Having spent many hours editing the report, I can tell you there's an awful lot more in there. Well, we have your details, so you will be on the mailing list as soon as that report comes out. So look forward to that in your inbox on September the 19th. Now is it is my task to invite the panelists to the podium. I think we have a full house. Her Excellency is on her way, I understand, and we hope that we will enjoy her closing remarks in just a minute. But in the meantime, we have a full house of panelists. So perhaps Dr. Mahmoud, you could come and join the panel again. I think it's safe to say you need no introduction at all, since we're all already benefiting from your wisdom. Thank you. Dr. Hanan Mossi, who's the Chief Economist of UNECA, the Deputy Executive Secretary of UNECA. Many thanks. Welcome. Professor Kevin Chiko-Orama, who is the Chief Economist at the African Development Bank. Welcome, Professor Orama, please. Rami Al-Tokani, welcome. You've already been introduced to the floor, but the chairman of the Stock Exchange, congratulations on your appointment. You're very welcome. And last and definitely not least, Dr. Simon Zadek, the chairman of F4B. Welcome. I would like to start by asking each of you very quickly, for one takeaway fact out of that report. There's so much to discuss, and there are lots of questions I want to ask you anyway, but perhaps Simon, maybe we could start with you. One takeaway fact. Oh, there you go, you have a microphone. Perhaps there's a... Voila.
Technological.
I'm good at that. Yeah.
That's great. So actually, I'll give more than one fact.
No, but keep it short though.
I know. The first fact is just absolutely brilliant. Yeah, I thought that was a great presentation, some really fascinating data underlying it. And actually, I'm going to highlight the absence of a fact, if I may. Yeah, which is definitely not a criticism, but more of a question, which is, how much of that investment drives revenue generation or changes, for example, sovereign risk pricing? You know, I'm really curious as to kind of not which sectors it goes into, but what are the feedback effects into economic drivers and the cost of capital? Maybe it's something that we could hear a little bit about.
Perfect.
Well, impressive presentation. I'm eager to see the report. Already asked you for a copy, and this is basically the kind of evidence that we like to guide our priorities based on it. One comment related to what you touched upon in this excellent presentation, and the interlinkages between climate finance and development finance. And it's great that you only mentioned co-benefits in one context when you said the importance of coordination between different departments and agencies, unlike what was there until very recently, when the enthusiasts and supporters of climate finance to solve everything say, well, we'll do climate finance and you will live on the co-benefits. Now, the issue of co-benefits here are basically these strong positive externalities that had an impact on coordination in institutions within countries and beyond. The other thing that we need to say, well, this is an excellent picture of what we have, and I like your conclusion that the mix of finance is more biased, as we know, country by country, and then this continent in Africa, that it has more dependence on that instrument. But basically what we can really be doing better, especially when the adaptation part is going to be taking more traction, to have more private sector participation, more equity-based finance, and more grants. Otherwise, perhaps when you do this exercise again, you will be still seeing this kind of bias, but perhaps even increasing more with the trajectory that we have today. Thank you.
Thank you. Hanan. You need to,
Thank you. So I think, thank you very much. I think it's a really insightful and interesting presentation. To me, the issue here is I think we need to perhaps recast the discussion. So I come from a different background, a macroeconomist background. And to us, we've been talking for years about decades, about global imbalances. And I don't think there is any bigger global imbalance than what we see in the environment. Yet, it's not so much the core focus, and it should be the core focus, because that's the only way the problem can be addressed and resolved. You cannot have those that cause the vast majority. Africa only contributes like 3% of the global emissions, and yet they face the brunt of the impact and are the most vulnerable, and yet they have the least adaptive capacity. We need to think really about, like, when we talk, we're always talking about these global imbalances. We need to focus on global imbalances in the environment space and climate change. And we also need to think about the issue of inclusion of finance in climate finance.
You're straying into the discussion, Hannah. What about this?
Exactly. So I think, to me, these are the key takes that this presentation left me thinking of.
Okay, very good. Yes. Professor, I know you came in late, so if you want to skip this question, you're very welcome to. But if you saw something that particularly interested you, then please say.
Okay, thank you very much. And apologies for being late. I was running from another session in the convention center. Based on the invitations, I didn't see the presentation in full, but based on the invitations and the brief I've seen of the report, one of the things that really is take home for me is one thing we also found in our own report. It touches on what Hanan was pointing at and what Mahmoudin talked about in the panel session on the plenary day with regard to what type of financing actually works for climate change, because the current one we have is not working. So, and this report tries to point to that somehow. And this is an area that we actually need to look at in more deep detail as we go to the COP. And the issue about debt instruments being used as climate finance is befuddling for me, because that debt is increasing other vulnerabilities in these countries. Debt vulnerabilities is increasing. And then because it's debt instruments, the highly vulnerable countries can't access it. at the same time. So it discriminates against the lower emitters and credits higher emitters. And then also it creates more problems for the higher emitters, especially in the middle income countries that cannot access it.
Great.
So that aspect of looking at how do we rethink the climate finance instruments that we use so that it doesn't create more problems and more trade-offs for countries. That's one. Then the other one is the trade-off between climate financing and other SDG financing. The ODA is being rebranded. I think you put it in a very clever way. The other day you talked about greenwashing and another word you used on the other side of the greenwashing aspect. So the point here then, so you talked about green exclusion, greenwashing and green exclusion. That green exclusion is the fact that the instrument we're using excludes those who really need it. And the greenwashing for me is the lack of clarity and transparency in what actually is climate finance. So anything can now become climate financing, provided that it has we tag green on it. So let me stop here for now.
Okay, no, great. So Rami, can you raise some more equity for us, please?
So, well, the main thing that I took from the report and the presentation that equity financing is very limited. And I think that if you expect investors to come into equity, they need an informative decision. They need an informative study. This is the main pain point when it comes to this area. The lack of data, the lack of disclosures, proper information available for a lot of projects in Africa is missing. And this is the main barrier for investors to put in equity, because if you want to put them equity, so they need to have an expected return on that. They cannot calculate that without proper data. We do not have proper databases for green projects throughout the continent. We do not have proper data for disclosures. We do not have many things that is lacking in our part of the world. This is why you do not see a lot of ESG funds investing into our part of the world, although it's been kicking off in the last 2-3 years all over the world, but this part of the world is still lagging behind because of that reason. I think this is the main point that I took from the report.
Great. Professor, can I come back to you actually on the question of data gaps? And you made the very eloquent point about the trade-off between ODA and climate finance, which is a big risk, particularly as development budgets get more challenged. But what about the other data gaps? Because I think one of the data gaps that we report on is this south-south flows. We don't know, because China and other south-south investors don't disclose that. We don't know how much capital is coming in that is green from those parts of the world. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's basically is the major aspect in terms of the data gaps is driven by the lack of clarity in what actually is climate finance and what is development financing. And then the second thing is the behavior of creditors. And it's not only in climate that we see it across all investment streams. And one of the major challenges there is also the capacity of the countries with whom we are working, and institutional. When I say capacity, is not only the capacity to build bankable projects, but also the capacity for regulation and governance in countries. So because what's driving some of the data gaps that you are alluding to, when you are doing like climate for nature swap, in Africa, most governments don't even know what they have in terms of the natural resources that they are swapping. They don't know the value of that natural resource. So if you are a hawk as an investor, it's a green field for you. And then you just go in and get, and then you are not going to declare that because it will affect your bottom line. And now we talk about private financing, private capital flows, and we heard very clearly, eloquently, 96% of that is not coming onto the continent, even though we expect the yield is very high. There are fundamental reasons why that is happening. And those fundamental structural reasons, data reasons, governance reasons, and corruption, and many other things is behind the data gaps that we all allude to. So I like to look at things at both sides. So it's not just the creditor, but also the African countries, making sure that transparency and accountability is built into the deals that they make using the public resources that's available to them.
So perhaps we can just stick to that theme, Mahmoud, if we may. The leverage ratio of international finance to African supplied climate finance is worryingly divergent, right? So for every dollar of international finance that there is, we get 15 cents of response from Africa, you could say. Of course, that's not right, because as we were just hearing, a lot of it is debt. And so it does become an African financing issue. So we have to unpack that number. But how do you account for that apparently low African response to the money that is coming in from MDBs in particular? Sorry.
Right. Well, let me build on the issue of data first. And well, great that we have this kind of approach. We'll talk about the continent, but I think any minister from any country would require to have the same report focusing on her or his country. So this could be another exercise. And then we can really answer your question, because the average could really be misleading, especially with a continent like ours that has a great deal of discrepancy in terms of size, capacity, great discrepancy as well in income and wealth. The other thing here is basically about how can we really get some sort of answers to new instruments that could really encourage this kind of domestic response that you might be expecting, that every dollar coming from outside, public external finance or private external finance, how that could be matched by the local community and by the old term of domestic resource mobilization. What we see today in climate finance is the same problem that we have been seeing forever in the domestic resource mobilization from the MDGs, before the MDGs, and beyond. And that really requires perhaps a better answer for that question about that. When we were talking about domestic resource mobilization, it didn't really come from the countries that are going to benefit from this domestic resource mobilization. It came primarily from some of the donor countries to say, well, do the domestic resource mobilization to be less dependent on the 0.7%. The argument should be very much different, that domestic resource mobilization, this is the revenue side, that should really be matched by how to spend the money. And if you get that guided by the SDGs at large and climate action, which is SDG 13, perhaps you can really have better response to that. Then they can really get some better response, not just from the government side, when it's response not just to the dollar coming, because it's not the issue like I generated $1 from outside. So how that is the response? You do it in a different way. Say, well, this is your external finance, and this is the ratio, the external to domestic ratio. That domestic ratio will be more enhanced by the public finance side, perhaps by more mobilization of resources at the subnational level, which is missing in action in many cases while the resources are there. But people will not be encouraged to contribute, but through answering the question about transparency, about disclosure, how the money is being spent. Is it going to be spent on climate and SDGs, or is it going to be part of the illicit financial flows at the end? So it's much more that holistic approach that we embrace in this COP is bringing back matters to where they belong. We can't really fix a problem here, but basically we need to really to see the repercussions elsewhere. So it's basically a whole of system approach that can provide a better answer to your question and at a country level, and then aggregate it from where you ended.
So maybe, Rami, I can come back to you. I mean, so a lot of it is about the development of capital markets and domestic capital markets ability to crowd in private investment. How does the EGX view sustainability and this opportunity, and what are you doing to do that?
Well, EGX for a long period of time, I think we were the first in the region, maybe second worldwide, to issue the first sustainability or an ESG index back in 2010. with the S&P. And since then, we have been taking many steps to enhance sustainability, project sustainability awareness in the region. Egypt is one of only 2 countries in the Arab world that has mandatory ESG disclosures for all the corporates. So we're working many steps on that, but the problem is always with the understanding of corporates for what is ESG. There is lack of understanding and lack of awareness. They always correlated sometimes with CSR. They always correlated with some social activities that's happening on the side. They do not understand the value of ESG because still it's not a commercial product for them in order to give them the awareness. So the role of capital markets is to give them this commercial aspect of that and to provide them with a marketplace and a tool that commercialize these carbon emissions, to commercialize and build upon many projects that they're doing. So in EGX, we are looking heavily into a carbon market, and we hope to have some good announcements very soon with some of our partners back for the green fintech thing, and we have attracted one of the fintechs from abroad also in discussions with them to come and build platforms with us. So we're doing several steps on that. Capital markets will always be in a better position to provide investors an informed decision to come. This is the philosophy in EGX. This is what we're trying to do. The region is still struggling. I want to share with you like a nice story. Before I come and chair EGX, I was heading the Arab Federation of Capital Markets. And along with Refinitiv in 2020, we issued the first pan-Arab low carbon index. It consists of 40 companies from 8 different markets in the region. And ever since, we've been facing hard time marketing to asset managers in order to create a regional ETF. They still do not understand it. They still do not see the demand for it in this part of the world. Investors do not put money in this part of the world for this product because the lack of projects, the lack of disclosures, the lack of data coming outside.
Right.
So in a nutshell, this is the role of capital markets, and this is our philosophy in EGX for the way forward for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Simon, back to you. When you look at, okay, I'm going to ask you a sort of philosophical question. When you look at the scale of the challenge, do you get depressed, or do you think, right, we must do a whole lot more? What do you feel when you look at this 9 times leverage, or this 9 times multiplier thing that we need to go through to get to the 280? I mean, how do you think about that?
Okay, well, I'm not trying to run a sort of open therapeutic session. That seems, well, maybe later over dinner. But I guess it slightly begs a question, which is there a causal relationship between the 2 sets of numbers? Yeah, because the way in which they're presented, quite rightly, because you just presented it descriptively, not analytically, is you've got a big number there and a little number there. And the question is the big number creating the little number? You know, do we have a problem of international public finance crowding out private finance? You know, a question I'm sure would be, I'd be very interested to hear a little bit more from other folks, because the assumption that's being made implicitly in the conversation so far is that the 2 are completely separate numbers. Isn't it good we've got the public numbers? But that may not always be the case. And of course, there's a long discussion that has gone for many years as to whether there are some forms of DFI financing that are imitating the market, but on subsidized terms, yeah, and are not taking the kind of risks that are really needed. So it'd be interesting to hear a little bit as to whether actually we need less of one to get a bit more of the other, or at least a very different kind of one in order to get more of the other. That would be sort of one piece of the story. I'm not answering your question as to whether I'm depressed. I think
no, you're not.
That would be more a sort of doctor type query. But the second piece, perhaps coming back to the carbon market point that was made, I kind of feel we're sort of missing the demand and generative side of the conversation, and that was the point I made a little bit earlier. I hear a little bit from the presentation as to the, for example, sectoral destination of some of the flow of finance, and obviously the different kinds of financial instruments. But what I don't really understand is whether we're looking at climate finance as being economically generative or not. You know, and I'd love to get some comments as to whether perhaps the way it's defined or the way in which we're analyzing isn't really giving us the core information we need, which is what's the contribution to economic growth? What's the contribution to equity outcomes? What's the contribution even to just basic resilience stuff?
Yeah. And as I think you said, with these, you said climate finance is development finance. So, and Hanan, I'm going to come to you just in a minute. Yeah.
Right. I have been exposed to almost 10 years of Sadek, Simon Zadek's kind of tough comments and questions and insightful issues that could really lead us to some other discussion. But what he said now about the possibilities of crowding out is very relevant. And he put it in a general way. I can give you a specific case in this very country, and colleagues and friends of the media or connected to the media, this is not really to be shared beyond this room, I hope. But anyways, so in the specific case of infrastructure, which is basically the type of sector and project that gets most of the funding, we had options to develop airports in this country based on PPPs. And you can really put all of the rules, including green elements, you called it environment then, and some safeguards. And the other option is to borrow fast and relatively cheap from the World Bank and the African Development Bank to enhance the capacities of some of the terminals. So what happened is a classic case of crowding out in all dimensions. First, you lost private sector investment because that PPP could come through a mix of domestic and foreign direct investment. Second, the government, instead of being a public owner there, it could be a regulator and a supervisor. Third, with the modernization of terminals, the capacity to develop and take more risks, including further greening and further digitalization, was missed in most of our airports. So this is a classic case that you would say, well, everybody is wise at hindsight, but some of us, I will not attribute it to anybody in this room, including me, but some of us, not because they are wiser, but because they have seen some sophisticated cases, including from some of the neighboring countries that develop that kind of thing. So whom to blame here? Is it a government or is it the lender of the government? The impact in all cases, it's on the public that could have benefited from less debt, more private sector investment. And if we are eager as we are to borrow more, we will go and borrow for areas that are very much hard to find the private sector finance from outside and inside. So this is the whole thing about get matters back to basics, holistic approach, realize the comparative advantage of finance, where the public dollar should be and where the private dollar should be.
Yeah.
Or the pound for that.
No, thank you. Yeah, I mean, so Hanan, if I may, I've got two questions for you. I'm going to talk to you about nature. I'm going to ask you something about nature in just a minute. But just before we do, I mean, do you think this seems to be suggesting that the MDBs, the public sources of money, even though they're the big providers of climate finance, perhaps they need to be doing more to crowd in the private sector?
Absolutely. Actually, that was exactly the point I wanted to make. Is what we need is a lot more investments in general, and this can only be done by giving the setup that can allow this crowding in. That would be through blended finance, okay, that can help bring in more the private sector. That can be through guarantees to reduce risk. There has to be ways by which this, international support is able to enable crowding in more private investments. I think that is key. And then at the same time, we need to have the mechanism through which if that had to be resorted to, that can be done at better terms.
Yeah.
It cannot be, you cannot ask, it's like, it's double offense. You're first, the continent is not the major contributor, then they get penalized by the impact of it, and then you're asking to go borrow at a very high cost of capital that is only increasing. It doesn't add up. And this is why I was saying it needs to be more inclusive, the
Right.
climate finance options that are available. That's why things like what we had before, for example, talked about, debt for nature swaps, issues of deepening the liquidity and sustainability facility that ECA has been advocating for to, really deepen the liquidity in the markets and create repo market that can allow actually in the long term for the reduction of cost of debt. So these are the type of things that we need to have.
We're getting a little bit late, and I do want to give the opportunity to a couple of people on the floor if they want to ask questions. But while you're thinking of your questions, Hanan, nature, biodiversity, coastal, those sort of things are very, very small. I mean, we just about got a pulse out of the report. 200 million out of the 5 billion of stated opportunity, according to UNEP. How do we do more on generating investment in nature?
So there are a number of initiatives that actually ECA has been, working on. The Great Green Wall, the Great Blue Wall. And these are the type of things that we need to ask when the continent, basically African countries, face losses and damages from climate change, on average 2 to 5% of GDP a year. Well, if there is a fair, inclusive system, that would mean that someone would need to compensate them. And that compensation should come from the largest emitters. And through actually very focused interventions through existing initiatives. It can be Great Blue Wall, it can be the Great Green Wall, it can be debt swaps, but there need to be a very focused discussion on this, mechanism through which these compensations happen, because otherwise, I think we were in Rotterdam together, and some of the discussions on the table, they said, okay, is it only because we are contributing 3%? Should it be 30%? Yeah.
Okay, good.
So,
right.
Exactly.
No, okay, so we're gonna. Okay.
Well, I will be in trouble. I can't really get away upsetting a couple of ministers responsible for bad projects in airports. But Dr. Hanan reminded me, this is the kind of generation that the world is going to be facing when you take education of young girls more seriously than we had done in the past. I repeated this 3% story. I said, well, they will not ever bother to discuss with you anything unless you reach that significant level of negotiation for you to have a place to bargain and to argue. As far as you are 3%, you'll be remaining 3%. So what's the guidance here? For us to wait until we are 30%, or some wise people would really see that what kind of danger adopting the same technologies for production, that while everybody's trying to reduce the emissions and Africa has the right to grow, urbanize, and use more energy for production and consumption, and that share will not be remaining 3% forever. So for that to be solved, it's two things, finance and science, starting with that.
So Simon, one more thing. Oh, have you finished? Have you done? Are you done? Quick word from Simon, and then questions on the floor. Anybody?
Yeah, just very briefly, just since you asked the nature question, I've got to give kind of a variant of the answer. So if one thought about natural capital in Africa as a technology with an intellectual property wrap, we would be having a completely different discussion. Yeah, and actually that's exactly what it can be and what it is. We heard from Minister White, around Gabon, and obviously all the public externalities, and his question quite rightly that we all ask but should act on is how much are people willing to pay for those benefits, and what kind of markets do we need to develop to ensure that those trades actually happen? Yeah, and of course, if you think of natural capital as a technology, then Africa is extraordinarily wealthy and has extraordinary and unique technology relevant to every product and service on the planet. Yeah, and so final point, back to the carbon market story, the danger is that actually natural capital does become monetized, increasingly is traded, and actually the terms of trade are against, once again, the owners of natural capital. You know, we see that in carbon markets today, where we're getting a few bucks a ton, you know, down on the supply side of nature-based solutions that are being flipped at 75 bucks a ton in Europe and elsewhere. So actually, we're beginning to create the right kind of markets with the wrong kind of governance arrangements. And so Africa needs to step in to the way in which those markets are being governed, because the opportunity is huge, but the risk of those markets going wrong is equally vast.
Yeah, absolutely right. Good. Any questions from anybody quickly? Good. Let's take 3 and see how we get on, and then I think we'll probably need to start wrapping up. Thank you, and please say who you are.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I'm Juan Chebley from the World Food Program, an economist, also chairing our debt swap task team. So I have 2 questions, if you allow me. Number 1, why do we keep talking about, talking about depressive facts? Why do we keep talking about costs and gaps as if it were a burden, as opposed to an investment opportunity? I think that if we had a more positive outlook towards the benefits, I mean, we're think about all the spillover effects across the economy. I am Venezuelan, #1 oil reserves in the world. If we were to extract all of that oil, we would be much worse off than if we just leave it on the ground. Are we thinking about that? Are we talking about the trillions as an investment opportunity, and maybe do the groundwork? Number 2 is how then we can look at alignment instead of additionality. I think that's an important question as well. Part of my job is to think of our humanitarian investments as a first step towards not contravening SDG 13, 14, 15, but rather to kickstart and catalyze some of that spillover effect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And maybe, Professor, we could ask you to talk about that alignment issue. And because it's back to before you arrived, we were talking about mainstreaming and the need to do a lot more of that. Okay, so perhaps we can come back to you on that. Any others? Thank you, please.
I actually want to play back 2 points that you made that I thought were very powerful. One was the question, is international public finance crowding out private finance? And the reverse question of the question was, do we need a different kind of DFI funding to trigger more private investment? Because that's a huge gap. Now, what I didn't hear very much of, and I know we're racing towards COP27, which is in 60 days, is how do the international sustainability standards, which is creating that global baseline, how does that begin to shift things? Because we've talked about getting investments into ESG. Rami, you talked about that. There's not enough in spite of all the effort that has been done locally. Whereas if the disclosures of ESG risks and opportunities are more transparent, are more visible, and are purpose fit also for the African continent specifically. And if, like with the IFRS accounting standards, we have a generic adoption of sustainability standards, will that not drive more capital, more investment that we need, as well as pushing DFI funding the way that we did to bolster our institutional capacity, our understanding, awareness, and knowledge, and our capture of this very precious resource we have, our natural capital, which then translates into carbon credits and everything else. But that is my question. Sorry, it was a bit long.
Okay, no, that's great. And Rami, I'm going to ask you to answer the question about, do you really believe that ESG disclosure is going to lead to more investment opportunity? So I'm going to leave that with you. One more question. Thank you, Nigel.
So it's really a question about how emerging markets, particularly Africa, might adopt a more assertive position with regards to developing carbon markets. I mean, a lot of the work I did back when we launched the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition at the World Bank, and when we worked with Pascal Canfin at COP25, was around the idea of establishing carbon pricing corridors, a bit like California has a ratcheted floor and base. But I wonder whether Africa collectively could take a stance on only selling credits above a certain floor price, rather as a way to try and, it's a negotiation, right? And there's quite strong demand growth, but I wonder whether there might be a possibility, you think, for collectively a more assertive position on sort of only engaging in that market if there are certain minimum value propositions.
So quality credits rather than volume, yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
no, not just quality credits, but quality pricing.
Okay, all right. So go on then, Simon, you answer that question. Yeah.
I'm the wrong person. So it's completely clear that particularly voluntary carbon markets, the entire structure of them have been negotiated to focus on the carbon ton rather than the pricing model. And we have asymmetric information and asymmetric negotiation capabilities that's leading to another extractive round through carbon markets that were meant to be, equitable outcomes as well as further carbon mitigation. This isn't going to resolve itself through market clearing, which is what some of the international financial market players are arguing. This has to be resolved through collective action. So I can't answer your question from an Africa perspective, but I would argue that without more collective action around price setting, it's going to be really hard to see how this plays out. And I would add, there's more and more, despite people's concerns about the science, more and more evidence that we're going to see a surge in biodiversity credit markets. This is kind of the next round, despite all of the measurement problems, which we all know about. Australia's just announced the first national biodiversity credit market. This is the next game in town. It's going to be huge. And Africa has the opportunity to get in now onto the way in which they're governed and constructed, rather than allowing, once again, the international financial community to really set the terms of the game.
So Hanan and then Rami.
Thank you. Just wanted to get to the first question that was asked, which is a very valid one on, why we're not seeing the opportunity. I think that's a very good point, because Africa sequestered 30% of global needs. So that's a huge opportunity if we can translate it into efficient, integral carbon markets. And actually, this is one of the areas where ECA has been working on, basically in, having harmonized protocol and enhancing, the pricing and so on for the Congo Basin at a regional level. So it's a great opportunity, needs a lot of work, but yes, there are opportunities, not only cost, but it needs also the reform of the global system to make it properly work.
Okay.
Thank you.
Rami, you're obviously going to say yes, ESG disclosure does change behavior, but what are your thoughts? And how receptive really is the market going to be in, let's say, 5 years?
Well, definitely the more data and more disclosures there are, definitely this would lead to better ESG funding and ESG funds to be created and to be directed to this part of the world. This is a no-brainer. Let's look to the experience in Europe and North America. The number of funds that has been, or ETFs that has been created in the last 2 years by far has been extracting higher inflows than any other asset class in the region. But in this part of the world, yeah, definitely, this is what we're lacking. And you speak with any international organizations like Refinitiv, Bloomberg, any Sustainalytics, anyone who actually gathered data in order to interpret ESG factors and rankings in this part of the world, they're having many pain points, and we're trying to solve them for it. I think that we had with the London Stock Exchange with the Refinitiv team, they told us language is a barrier. So I told them, okay, so we need to tackle that, or maybe you need to hire some Arabic-speaking analysts who actually can capture the data to do that. The quality of the data is still not understood. This has pushed the regulators to put mandatory templates for these kind of disclosures. In my opinion, it could be definitely enhanced in this part of the world. Here comes the role of international organizations to help us with the proper disclosures that they need to be put. Capacity building is a must in this part of the world. We need to educate the corporates, we need to educate investor relations officers to understand actually what is ESG in order to communicate it better to their investors.
But you need regulators to regulate as well, don't you?
Exactly.
Yeah, and perhaps on a limited level of ESG disclosure that the market can cope with in some of these smaller markets. Listen, I think we need to pause because it's very late, and I'm very sorry we're not going to see the minister, unfortunately, but we want to thank her for saying yes originally, but she's obviously been taken up. So I just want to finish by thanking all of you for staying on quite so late, for thanking everybody online who's managed to hang on in there as well. We really appreciate that. We had a lot of registrations online. So, so we're very grateful to all of you. I want to say thank you to Climate Policy Initiative for all their hard work. And above all, thank you to our fantastic panel for agreeing to be here. We immensely appreciate your participation and very, very grateful. And we look forward to sharing the data and hopefully repeating the research in a year's time. Thanks so much indeed.